The first New Englanders were religious separatists, but their Englishness, their rights as Englishmen, were very important to them and were maintained. They all felt themselves Englishmen and given the rights that were enshrined in the English tradition and in the Magna Carta.
Christian, thank you again for joining us on this podcast series about Boston, the events leading up to it, and then ending with Evacuation Day, March 17th, 1776. And as you know, that we already have a series of videos going through the acts from 1763 onward and on to Lexington and Concord, April of 1775, and then comes the surrounding of Boston and the events that followed that, which we're going to be going through. But I know that before the surrounding of Boston, for people to understand that impact, some things occurred beforehand that lead up to that you may feel doesn't get as much publicity as some of the other events. They walk through, okay, well, then there's the Boston Massacre, there's the Tea Party, and then there's Joseph Warren's fifth anniversary of the Boston Massacre, but then there's the First Continental Congress and Galloway's plan, Suffolk resolves all of this and then Gage coming in and Hutchinson going out. So, but we find ourselves after Lexington and Concord, the surrounding of Boston, the British troops have come back to Boston with their tail between their legs, and now everything is changing. Up to this point, we didn't have a conflict, but now we've got this. And so, from your viewpoint, for somebody to really understand the background of the surrounding and then what happens after that, what would you want somebody to know of that history that really clicks into what's happening in Boston and how people are responding?
Let's start with the mentality of New Englanders as Englishmen. I think that's really important. So I'm going to take you back even further to the very beginning of New England in 1620. That's when the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, Mayflower, and all that. The first New Englanders were religious separatists who had left England behind because of fundamental differences they had with the church. But their Englishness, their rights as Englishmen, were very important to them and were maintained. And while the people who settled New England were here for a multitude of different reasons, religious, political, economic, they all felt themselves Englishmen and given the rights that were enshrined in the English unwritten constitution, English tradition, and in the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was the great charter that limited the power of the king. So the king's power in England was checked by Parliament. And in the colonies, especially in the New England colonies, there were similar mini versions of that type of government. In Massachusetts, we operated under what was called the Massachusetts Bay Charter that had a royal governor in the position of the king. At the time the revolution began, his name was Thomas Hutchinson, and the royal governor was regulated by a legislative body, which we called the General Court. And the General Court had to approve, for instance, any taxes that would be enforced in Massachusetts, the same way that Parliament would have to approve any taxes that were going to be collected back in England. And so there's the beginning of the conflict. And what happens is that in the late 1760s, As a result of huge war debts that the British had acquired following the French and Indian War, they look for additional streams of revenue and they begin to tax the colonies. But the taxes are coming from Parliament, mostly because they are taxes on imported goods, goods being transported across the ocean. And it's this kind of gray area. Who has the right to tax imported goods? Is it the colony? Is it the motherland? Is it England? And this is the beginning of the conflict. And if you asked most New Englanders at that time in the late 1760s what they were so upset about, what they were ready to take up arms about, it was the fact that their rights as Englishmen were being infringed upon.
Okay.
And that is the key.
Okay. So
And
that,
so, yeah. To go a little further, you mentioned the Boston Massacre. I'm
yes.
glad that you brought that up. We
Okay.
are recording this in
Yes.
early March, March 5th, 1770, right around this time of the year, was the date of some of the first bloodshed of the conflict that will eventually culminate in the shot heard around the world in the start of the revolution. And to understand the Boston Massacre, the Bloody Monday, March 5th, 1770, you've got to understand that conflict of the taxes. So as these taxes are being implemented, the king and parliament decide to send soldiers into Boston to enforce these taxes, taxes that people see as unfair and unjust, taxes that nobody wants to pay. And as old as taxes are, there's going to be tax evasion. And there are lots of people who are evading these taxes on imported goods by smuggling them in. So these soldiers are sent here beginning in 1768 to enforce those taxes, make sure nobody's smuggling goods in, search for contraband and such. And one of those soldiers is standing guard duty in front of the townhouse, the government officials building in Boston, the building that you could still visit today. Today we call it the Old State House. And on a Monday morning in the middle of March, I don't know if you can see out the windows behind me, but this is New England for you. It's gray, it's
Great.
bleak, it's dreary. It's a Monday morning. Nobody's in a good mood. And this British soldier is harassed by a young boy about the age of 16. The boy had worked in a barber shop, and the soldier had recently gotten his wig done at the barber shop. And he didn't have enough money to pay for the barber's bill. So he got the wig done on credit. He promised to pay the barber. And the boy, recognizing the soldier as being the guy who owed his boss some money, he said to the soldier, "Hey, when are you going to pay my boss?" And the soldier responded by saying to the boy, "If I knew where I could find some work, I'd be able to pay off that bill."
Ah.
And the boy, being a bit of a wise guy, a young teenage boy, he gives him a hard time because, "Oh, I know what you can do. Come to my house and you can clean the toilets, clean the outhouse," which was the lowest job in colonial society. In Boston, it was one guy that cleaned all the outhouses in town, and he also
Gosh.
was the executioner. He was a
Ah.
persona non grata. He was an unspeakable within the community. So it was an insult to the soldier that he might clean somebody's outhouse or his toilet. And being angry, he struck the boy in the face with the butt end of his musket.
Oh my
So the
gosh.
boy's got a bloody nose, and he runs to a nearby tavern where there's a group of drunken dock workers. Dock workers, by the way, who've had their jobs taken by these British soldiers. When the soldier asked the boy if he knew where he could find some extra work, that's a clue to some of the social dynamics that were going on in Boston. And by the way, Boston at that time was a pretty small town. There were only about 12 to 15,000 people in the town. And these soldiers, there were several thousand of these soldiers, were allowed to take part-time jobs when they weren't on duty. So they were undercutting the local labor market, especially the menial jobs, things like unloading boats, stuff that the lower classes would do. So these guys on the docks were already angry that their jobs were being taken by British soldiers. Never mind the politics and the taxes and all that goes into it. They were just angry that these guys were coming into their territory. So when the boy busts into the tavern with the bloody nose, these soldiers are in trouble because there's a bunch of angry dock workers that are looking for trouble. And sure enough, they come out of the tavern They start throwing snowballs at the British soldiers, shouting insults at them. And before you know it, there are 9 British soldiers who fire their muskets into the crowd.
Yeah.
Ultimately, 5 men are dead,
Hmm.
including famously a man named Crispus Attucks, who was a black man. He was one of the first casualties of the conflict that will eventually turn into the revolution. Again, this is March 5th, 1770. It would
Okay.
take 5 years for events to unfold and the first shots to be fired, but this is a good starting point.
Okay. That and as far as the Tea Party, did that? Well, of course, that was not called the Tea Party back then, but it wasn't it the Tea Destruction?
That's correct. Yeah, the first term, the use of the Tea Party isn't going to appear for nearly 50 years after the event. The Tea Party happens in 1773. So that's about 3 years after the Boston Massacre. Something really interesting happens after the Boston Massacre. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, most of the British soldiers who are occupying Boston are removed, partly because the British authorities realized they were sitting on a powder keg of
Yes.
angry colonists.
Yes.
The presence of the soldiers was likely going to lead to more violence. So, in a move to sort of tamp down the emotions, those soldiers are removed from the populace. There's also some change of leadership and policies in Parliament that go into this decision. Most of the taxes, too, are rescinded. But there is one tax on tea that is left around just to prove that Parliament has the right to tax imported goods, has the right to tax the colonies. But even that one tax on tea is too much for the colonists. And in December of 1773, an angry mob of some 200 men disguised to look like Mohawk Indians so that no one would recognize them, boarded 3 ships on the harbor front and destroyed tens of thousands of pounds of tea. Somewhere between 60 and 90,000 pounds of tea were dumped into the harbor that evening.
My
You know,
goodness.
we just recently passed the 250th anniversary of that event. This past December 2023, marked the 250th anniversary. We had a big reenactment in Boston. It's still a central part of our history. And of course, when we got around to naming it the Boston Tea Party, it became synonymous with the city.
Okay, that is interesting. Now, so that's 73, and then the next thing happened in 74, the coercive acts. Or
Exactly.
okay,
The
and
Tea
then
Party
go ahead.
the Tea Party is so important because it is the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back.
Okay,
For 7 or 8 years, the colonies had been growing in their rebellious nature. And when news of the Tea Party reaches London, Parliament and ultimately King George III decide they finally had enough. And they
okay,
decide no more Mr. Nice Guy, no more appeasing these colonies. We are going to show them the heavy hand. We are going to send in an overwhelming contingent of soldiers that will teach these colonists a lesson. And with them come a series of new laws meant to punish harshly Boston. And those laws are known in England as the coercive acts. They're meant to coerce the colonies into obedience. But in the colonies, they become known as the intolerable acts. It's no longer tolerable to live under these conditions. It's at this point on reflecting upon it, John Adams famously said, "The revolution was effected in the hearts and minds of the people before the first shots were ever fired." When those soldiers get here, when those laws are imposed, the colonists know that if they don't stand up at that moment and confront this injustice, they and their future generations will live as abject slaves and lower class citizens within the British Empire. They will have forgone their rights as Englishmen. And it is at this point that Dr. Joseph Warren, writes this amazing document called the Suffolk Resolves. And I mentioned it in our introduction. If you've watched that, the Suffolk Resolves were written in September of 1774. It is a document that many have called the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. And in the Suffolk Resolves, Warren lays out the arguments, the grievances, and the justifications for why the colonies should fight back against the crown. And in that document, he uses this great phrase: if they stand up now for their rights, a torrent of panegyrists will sing their praises into eternity.
Yes.
Panegyrist was a funeral orator, and I consider myself a type of panegyrist today.
Okay. Was it not at that time the First Continental Congress was considering another gentleman's plan, the Galloway Plan, that was not adopted, but just as soon as the writer, who was the courier that brought the Suffolk Resolves to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia?
That would be none other than Paul Revere.
Yes, I
Yes,
thought
Paul.
it might. It ties
He made,
together, doesn't it?
doesn't
And
it? It's
so
so
they
amazing.
get the Suffolk Resolves, they adopt it. And
Yep.
there was a line in there that said, I think it was in his preamble when he went down and gave the 19 resolutions, the colonies have witnessed the power, but not the justice, the vengeance, but not the wisdom of Great Britain. And
Great.
I think
Mhm.
that captured the First Continental Congress of Representatives' eyes on that. And they went through and continued to do that. Now, I understand, though, that while the First Continental Congress was going on in 74, the second, of course, will occur in 75, um, but that in 74, that then Gage started actually. Now, when did Gage come? Shortly before the First Continental Congress, or was that, or it was
Yeah,
close to it?
it,
But
it was
then,
around the same time. So Gage arrives in late August, early September of
okay,
74. That's what precipitates the writing of the Suffolk Resolves. The Continental Congress had just convened that early September. So they were meeting. It was one of their first actions of business at the First Continental Congress was to endorse the Suffolk Resolves, to vote to approve it. So one of the very first things they did. So Gage arrives, and essentially Gage arrives in Boston with the coercive acts in his hand.
I
And
see. Okay,
one of the things the coercive acts did was it nullified the charter, which we called the Massachusetts Bay Charter. That was the governing document, the agreement, if you will, the contract between the king and the Massachusetts colony as to how it would be governed. And that contract, that charter, is nullified. I always make the comparison on my tour to the radical nature of this, to the shock this was. If somebody were to stand up in Washington D.C. today and say, that Constitution we've been operating under for 250 years, well, that's no longer valid. It was that impactful to the people of New England and Massachusetts when the charter was nullified. And the charter called, as I mentioned earlier, for a royal governor. He was a political appointee. He was, not a soldier like Gage. His name was Thomas Hutchinson. And when Gage
yes,
arrives, Gage tells Hutchinson, "You are dismissed. You are no longer serving in office. Go to London. The king wants to speak with you."
okay,
Now, for Hutchinson, that must have been overwhelming because he was a native New Englander. He didn't have too much experience in the courts of London, so he must have boarded that boat with some trepidation as he had to go report to the bosses to how he lost control of the colony. By the way, he would never set foot back in Boston. Hutchinson would never return.
really,
And
okay,
no, he spent the rest of his life in England and wrote the history of New England there, a man without a country. Um,
wow,
he was a loyalist.
okay,
And Gage takes over and essentially establishes martial law. He as a
wondering,
general, is put in charge of Boston, the military, controls the streets.
Okay, so with the coercive acts, what was the king and parliament hoping to do with those acts? I mean, we're going to have the Lexington and Concord surrounding, but here are these coercive acts. What were they hoping how Boston and the colonies would respond to that?
Let me use an anecdote from my days as a teacher. If I had a
Okay.
troublesome student in my classroom, the first thing I would do is make him sit in the front row center. And the second thing I would do if he didn't shape up is I would scold him in front of the class, and I might even send him to the principal's office. Right? That is what the coercive acts were intended to do. They were isolating the most rebellious student in the class. That
Mhm.
was Boston. And the idea was that the other colonies would see what happened to Boston and they would stop any ideas about rebellion. It had exactly the opposite effect. Thankfully, the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, and this was a
Hmm.
representative body of all the 13 colonies, and they stood in solidarity with Boston. They supported Boston. And you got to remember, one of the things the Coercive Acts did was it blockaded Boston Harbor, or at least stopped the import of goods into Boston Harbor. This is what today we would call an economic sanction, right? They were going to
Yes.
shut down the commerce of Boston. People started sending in supplies overland. They were supplying the city in other means. So the coercive acts did not have their intended result of scaring the rest of the colonies.
It was my impression that when Gage, and of course, Gage married an American or a
Rebecca was his
colonist,
wife's name. Yeah.
a loyalist family. But it was his impression, as I understood, when the king called him in to talk to him about the colonies, that he said, well, just send me over there with two regiments and we'll get things straight because, and one of his assumptions was New Englanders don't get along with each other. You know,
Mm.
they're famous for disagreeing either about facts or just New England obstinacy. Now, I've not been grown and raised there, so I just have to take his word for that. But this galvanized them, brought them together in a way, and I
It's
understand that initially they thought they could isolate Boston from Massachusetts and Massachusetts from New England. And as you point out, which would have separated them from the rest of the colonies, but oh my gosh, they misread that. Now, two regiments, how many redcoats would be about two regiments?
so a regiment was approximately 2,000 soldiers. So you're looking at about 4,000.
Okay,
Ultimately, with some contingent of Marines and other soldiers, they came out to about a total of about 5,000 soldiers were sent to Boston in the aftermath of the Tea Party.
okay. And so you got 5,000, and how large is Boston again?
Again, at that time, about let's call it 15,000 people, roughly. So all of a sudden, you got 15,000 people, and there's 5,000 additional soldiers.
What did they
And
do
those
with them?
soldiers, they had to put them in people's houses, among other things. The
I
British
see.
officers were quartered in the homes of the colonists. So not only do you have a soldier in your town, you got a soldier in your living room with his 30 feet propped up on your couch and your coffee table. It's going to
Okay.
be problematic.
Well, I can understand the loyalists might have done one thing, but what did the patriots do?
Well, they weren't very happy about it. They put up with it as best they could. Um, Paul Revere, for instance, had Major John Pitcairn living two doors down from him. Among other things, the Patriots snooped into the British belongings,
Okay.
eavesdropped on their conversations.
Mhm.
And so this idea of putting the British officers in the home actually ended up being a bit problematic for the British, as there was a lot of espionage that went on.
I see. Well, what about the common soldier? I mean, of 5,000, would 1,000 be officers? And what did they do with the other 4,000, if that's the right numbers?
Yeah, the common soldiers were not boarded in the homes. It was just the officers. Common
Mhm.
soldiers were put in warehouses. They were they pitched tents on the Boston Common. Some of them stayed on the ships. Anywhere that they could find a space for the common soldier. It would have just been the officers that were housed in the quartering act.
Okay, so that as we are kind of building up this background of the surrounding Boston and maybe some of the problems there. So, was there any problem with desertions or disease with bringing another 5,000 people, especially soldiers, into an area that dwindled the numbers of the British?
Absolutely. Overcrowding was an issue. Feeding these soldiers was an issue. Disease was a common problem. There had been a smallpox epidemic that had broken out several years before the revolution. So there were many people at that point who had built up immunity to the smallpox. So that was a good thing in that regard. But this caused lots of strain within the social economic systems of Boston, especially. Now, as far as desertions, there weren't too many because the repercussions were severe. If you were caught deserting, you were summarily executed. But there was definitely an enticement, and there were more than a few deserters from the British Army who crossed into the colonial countryside and essentially disappeared. They were enticed with offers of land and other things that might have helped their cause. You got to remember, for a common British soldier, they were often put in the service for debt or to work off a crime they may have been involved in. So these weren't necessarily the most upstanding professional soldiers all the time, although there were many of those within the British ranks. There were quite a few opportunists, we'll call them, in the British ranks.
I see. Did so you've got these officers, you've got all these common soldiers. Were they over there by themselves, or did any of them bring families with them?
Yeah, it was common to bring your family, to travel with your wife and sometimes your children. So this adds again to the social burdens. It was a whole family affair at times for some. I think more so for the officer classes than the commoners, but there was definitely a little mixture of both.
So you've got um, a peninsula, a small area. You've got those that are living there. You're bringing in 4 to 5 thousand British troops. You're going to martial law rather than civil law, and there's competition for jobs. And so, just I'm just sensing how this difficulties and as you say, it's a powder keg there, can explode from there. So now, if part of the coercive acts was to block the Boston harbor so they weren't landing any supplies or anything there, where are the supplies coming in to support Boston? Or, I mean, with both patriots and loyalists, they've got to have some sort of supplies. Where are those supplies coming if they're not landing in Boston, not being unloaded, and nothing is shipping out?
Yeah. So let's take a step back for a moment and
Okay.
emphasize for listeners, that viewers that might not realize this. Boston at that time was a peninsula. You mentioned that earlier. But this peninsula was quite small. There were only 4.5 square miles within the peninsula of
Oh
Boston,
gosh.
overcrowded with more than 20,000 between the soldiers and the inhabitants. Now, many inhabitants would have evacuated and fled as a result of the British arrival. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly how many people were on the peninsula, but let's just say it was crowded at that point. Now, the British had one of the most powerful navies in the world. It was easy for them to control the seas, to control the harbor. It's if there were supplies coming into Boston Harbor, they would have been approved supplies that the British Navy brought in. So they were supplying their own soldiers and perhaps some of the loyalists and inhabitants. Now, as I mentioned, the Continental Congress supported and stood in solidarity. There were movements within the other colonies to fundraise and gather grains and wheat and other products and send those overland to Boston. There were also other ports, namely Salem, which was north of Boston, that were open. So you could bring cargo in on merchant ships through Salem, and that served as a secondary port during this time period.
Okay.
But all of these efforts were a lot more cumbersome and a lot more difficult.
And no doubt expensive.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. As we are building up to the surrounding of Boston, there's another issue, gunpowder. And
One of the,
I understand that gunpowder, and of course we know Lexington and Concord, the reason why Gage sent the soldiers out there was not only armament, artillery, muskets, but gunpowder as well. So why was gunpowder such a big issue?
Simply put, the ingredients to make gunpowder were not available in New England.
Uh,
So gunpowder was a prized commodity. It was in short supply. The one of the most important ingredients that goes into making the gunpowder, which is anal nitrate, which I believe I pronounced that's it was a product that came from the Caribbean. It was a byproduct of bird droppings. And so this nitrate was then used to bring in materials from the Caribbean. And because the British controlled the high seas, it was very difficult to get that ingredient to gunpowder in.
okay. So, and if you don't have gunpowder, you may
You're not
have
going to have a
lots
war.
lots of muskets and artillery, but those shells aren't going anywhere. So gunpowder was extremely important, which then also sheds a little bit more light on Lexington and Concord. But let's follow this gunpowder trail a little bit more. So the colonies, New England colonies, each one, as I understand, had an allocation of gunpowder for the militias in the different towns, and they had um, and not an armory, but a place where they would put the gunpowder to be supported. So everybody got an allocation of that, and they would get it from Gage and Boston. Is my understanding correct?
That's correct. These facilities were called powder houses. They
Ah,
were typically stone buildings. Obviously, gunpowder is highly explosive. So you wanted to keep all the gunpowder in one centralized location, far away from any other important buildings in the town in the event of an explosion or an emergency. So these powder houses were often located on the outskirts of the city. And one of the first things that Gage does when he arrives in Boston in the fall of 74 is he sends soldiers out to confiscate gunpowder from the various communities. There's a very famous incident that occurred in September of 74. It was called the Powder Alarm. And it was a rumor that spread throughout the area of Cambridge, roundabout where Harvard University is today, that the British were going to confiscate the gunpowder there. And there were 10,000 colonists that turned out to defend the stockpile of gunpowder in Cambridge. Now, the British soldiers never showed up that day, but instead of the first shots being fired at Lexington and Concord in April of 75, we could have had the first shots being fired in Cambridge in 74. It didn't
wow.
materialize that way, but it was close.
Which brings up another issue, Israel Putnam. There was a rumor that went out. I think that was in 74. It could be the same event where it was reported that six militia had been shot and killed by the British troops. Was that part of this powder house, or is that a separate incident?
I believe that was a separate incident. Israel
Okay.
Putnam was a farmer from Connecticut,
Okay.
a hard man, notorious, a legend of New England toughness. And So he was the leader of the local militias in Connecticut. And I think that story of the 6 militiamen killed comes from Connecticut.
Okay. And so weren't there additional militia that turned out for that as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
And
There were several incidents. There was an incident on one of the islands in Boston Harbor where some British soldiers went out to confiscate some livestock, some sheep that were on the island, and they were fired upon by locals. There was an incident up in Salem, Massachusetts, called Leslie's Retreat, named after a British officer, the Lieutenant Leslie, who went up north looking for gunpowder and was turned around by locals. They refused to drop a drawbridge for him. So there were many moments where the American Revolution could have begun. Tensions were at a breaking point. It just so happens it was in April of 75 that really everything comes to a head. So when that event happens, when the shot heard round the world is fired out there in Lexington and Concord, it's no surprise. It's not as if this hadn't been anticipated and sort of seen coming down the road.
okay, so if it hadn't been Lexington and Concord, it probably could have been somewhere else. And this all is building up the tensions and impatience between the Massachusetts, the rest of the New England colonies, and Boston, where Gage and the troops are. So something's going to give. And so that is building up to the surrounding of Boston. Now, there's another event, Continental Congress. They hear about the 6 militia being shot and killed, but they also hear that Boston is being bombarded and is on fire. Is that right?
Yes, it was a false rumor, but as they say, the fog of war, or in this case, pre-war, and of course, in a time when there was a lot of miscommunication, delayed communication, inaccurate stories were commonplace. So that was a rumor that had filtered down to Philadelphia. Ultimately, it was untrue.
Okay, and as I understand that Israel Putnam was the source of that rumor as well, and that when the First Continental Congress heard about it, they stopped where they were and declared war because they were there to see how could we respond to the mother country as a result of the coercive acts. We really want to up the communication. They heard that, they declared war, but then, as you say, a couple of days later, it was false. And so then they said, okay, that's okay. Then they get the
Never
Suffolk
mind.
revolts and they go there.
Yeah.
So I got my history right on them declaring war. Is that right?
As far as I believe, yes. I think
Okay.
they had to ask for a mulligan.
So a lot of Irishmen in Boston there. So now we're building up. This is the surrounding of Boston. Uh, Anything else any other tensions or inputs that would, Lexington, Concord. Now we've got 12, 15,000 men that are surrounding Boston here. Washington hasn't showed up yet, but that's going to be part of our next podcast. Anything else occurring? And of course, that we're in April of 75. The surrounding starts on the 20th of April. And the Second Continental Congress is going on. And then they will respond by saying, we need to organize and send a commander in chief of the Continental Army, which turns out to be George. So this is the building up and the tensions. Anything else that we haven't chatted about that would say, well, here's another thing we must consider before the Second Continental Congress actually decides to send Washington up there in June of 1775.
Yeah, I think what I would like to add as we build the story is the fact that the weather, the seasons play a major role.
Oh, really?
So
Okay.
when General Gage arrives, it's the late summer, early fall, September of 74, and he makes some initial forays that are looking for gunpowder. The powder alarm that I mentioned before in Cambridge is an example of that. But then winter sets in, and winter can be cold and brutal in New England. And Gage and his army camp in Boston, and there's not much activity that happens over that winter of 74 into January of 75. It's when the spring arrives and the weather starts to warm up and the
Yeah.
snow melts that Gage can resume his activities in search of this gunpowder and to suppress the rebel activities. I'd also add to that that the First Continental Congress disbands in that fall of 74. And the representatives to that First Continental Congress from Massachusetts, namely Samuel Adams and John Hancock, return home to Massachusetts from Philadelphia. And when they return home, they start to lead what is called the Provincial Congress. That is a local legislative body in Massachusetts. If you'll recall, I mentioned the General Court. That was the legislative body that was
Yes.
set up as a result of the Massachusetts Bay Charter. And when the charter was rescinded and nullified, the General Court was dismissed, and they were told that if they met, it would be an illegal assembly and they'd be subject to arrest. Well, clearly, they normally would meet in Boston. This legislative body, which is comprised of all the towns of Massachusetts, send elected officials to this legislative body. They decide to disobey the British laws and to meet again in secret in the town of Concord. And so it's in the spring and April of 75 that Hancock and Samuel Adams are leading the Provincial Congress, this illegal, in the eyes of the British, assembly in Massachusetts. That's what one of the reasons that leads the British out to Concord on the morning the American Revolution began.
Okay. All right. And then, of course, they were in Lexington, Adams and Hancock at Hancock's home there, his father's home. Uh, yes. Okay. Well,
Yes.
we have fleshed out those, as I had hoped, the background, building some suspense, building up how people are getting upset, even the British, and something's got to give. Talk about powder kegs. There were all sorts, anything. So from here, we'll talk about Bunker Hill. We'll talk about Ticonderoga. We'll be talking about Dorchester Heights of Action Day as we continue to move through the history of Boston during these revolutionary times. Thank you, Christian, for your time, your insights, and a lot of those little things that you bring in that you don't read in history books. And so look forward to getting together again and taking our next step in this review of Boston.
Thanks, Vern. It was great to talk with you.
Okay, thanks so much.